Salve omnes, and welcome back to Caesar, Book 5. In this video, we'll be going through chapters 34 and 35, following the AP Latin syllabus. Before we get into it, a quick recap of our color coding. Any word indicated in red is going to be our subject. Any word indicated in green is going to be a verb. And if we see a word indicated in blue, that would be our direct object. Also, anything indicated in boldface type is the main clause or thought of the sentence, and anything not indicated in bold is somehow subordinate to that. So, with all that out of the way, let's dive right in. When we left off in chapter 33, the Eburones had just attacked the Romans on the march, and Sabinus has not acquitted himself very well. Cotta, on the other hand, has been doing yeoman's work, both as a commander and as a soldier. The Roman plan is to form a defensive circle so as to repel the enemy attack. Unfortunately, their attempt to do this didn't turn out very well. Their men have been losing hope, and the enemy have been encouraged. Meanwhile, the Roman troops have been breaking ranks and going to the baggage to claim whatever they think they want the most. But still, the Romans do have a plan. And, though, as we see here at the start of chapter 34, at barbaris, here's that at again, right? If you've been watching the videos in order, one after the other, you'll know that at indicates, oh, well, on the other hand, barbaris consilium non defuit. For the barbarians, this is a dative of interest, a plan was not lacking. Okay, so the barbarians also have a plan. Let's see what their plan is. 4. Again, nam, usually explanatory. Duces eorum. So in this case, the duces eorum is referring to the Barbari, not the Romani. You have to be very careful once Caesar gets into his battle narratives to keep track of our pronouns, because they can come thick and fast. So the leaders of the barbarians ordered their men, or their commanders, right? We have to understand something to get to this active infinitive. Ordered their men to announce, or their commanders to announce, tota acie. Okay, place where? Something like all along the battle line, or along the entire battle line. That, now we're announcing, so again, we have a negative, in this case, indirect command. This is their command, that no one from their spot, or from their place in the line, or in the ranks, should leave. No one is to leave from their assigned position. We see this quis following a ne, and we remember our favorite rhyme. After si nisi numen ne, Ali takes a holiday. So this quis is really aliquis. No one. That's why it's no one and not someone. No one at all should depart from their posted position. And you'll notice now that we go into indirect speech, again triggered off the pronuntiare. So the command was that no one should depart from their assigned post. What they said was that theirs was the booty, okay, or the loot, right? Praeda, it's a fun Latin word. Theirs was the loot. So just to be clear here, the they that we're referring to, all right, is not the Romans, because the Romans aren't going to have any loot when this is over. This is the Gauls, as in the sense of the men, okay? So it's the same thing up here. The duces eorum, the leaders of the Barbari, announced to their men that they, right, the men, would get the loot. The loot would be for them, or would be theirs. And it would be reserved for them. The praedam is still the subject of this infinitive, reservari. The loot would be saved for them. And then, you know, it's kind of an expansion. You could also read, like, you could, if you wanted to, this quaecumque, you could read an ea being up here as the understood subject of reservari, or you can just read this quaecumque clause as standing in apposition to the praeda. You don't need to overthink it too much. The point is that the announcement was that they would get the loot, and it would be saved for them. What would be saved for them? Whatsoever, because of the quaecumque, whatsoever the Romans left behind. Okay, either because the Romans will have fled, or, more likely, because the Romans will be dead. So the announcement was that everyone should hold their position because they will get rewarded at the end. All right, so they should not break ranks to go and loot the Roman baggage or the Roman dead before the battle was actually over. Therefore, all right, perinde, as a result, therefore, and then we see this this little indirect speech right here. We see posita, the participle, which is indicated as a verb, which means there's an essay missing. So we can start with existimarent. Therefore, they, this would again be the common soldiers, the eorum and the illis from up above, they, the barbari, considered that everything was placed in victory. So the only thing that the men are thinking about is winning the fight, because they have been told by their commanders that there will be loot for them after the fight. Okay, moving on then. Now we get into kind of the back and the forth that Caesar likes to do, right? We see our men and we see the enemy. So, and he starts off with kind of praise of both. There was, both in courage and in zeal for fighting, this gerund, going with studio, all right, genitive gerund, but we can understand it, with for. There was some eagerness for the fight. They were equal. Okay, normally when we see essay as the first word of a sentence, we understand there is or there was, but in this case, we're talking about the men, both our men and the barbari. They were equal. They were pares, both in courage, manliness, right, manly excellence, and their eagerness for the fight. Our men, let's see what our men did. Our men, even though by their leader and by fortune, good luck, they had been deserted. And just an interesting little fact here, Caesar uses the singular duce. There are in fact 2 legates who are in charge of this force, but only one of them apparently has abandoned their troops. Interesting. Regardless. Anyway, nevertheless, right, our men placed all hope of safety, right, a genitive here with spem, the objective genitive, because it is the object of what they are hoping for. Our men placed all hope of safety in their courage. And whenever or however often any cohort, technically quaeque is something like each cohort, but whenever a cohort charged forth, literally ran forth, but obviously we're attacking, from that area, so in this case we might wish this ob were in that area, a great number of the enemy fell. Okay, so our men are doing quite well. They have been abandoned by their leader and by luck, right? Luck is not on their side and their leadership is lacking, but they're still doing their duty. They're placing their hope in their courage, and every time they make an attack, a great number of the enemy fall. However, quare animadversa. Again, we're starting a sentence with qui quod, a relative? No, a correlating. So this is actually hoc. Hoc re animadversa. Ablative absolute. When this thing was noticed, all right, and the thing, of course, would be that every time the Romans attack, they kill a lot of the enemy. Ambiorix ordered it to be announced. This is actually the passive infinitive, so this is being used impersonally. So we can say it to be announced rather than understanding something like centuriones or duces or something like that. What is the announcement, however? Just as before, right? Indirect commands, going all the way down, okay? What is his command? First, from a distance, their weapons they should throw. So the enemy should stand back and use their throwing weapons, their missile weapons. And this neu is an alternate form of neque and not. So we've gone into a negative purpose, not purpose clause, an indirect command. We've gone into a negative indirect command. So the first command was positive, stand at a distance, throw your weapons from a distance. The second command is negative, do not approach closer. Do not get into close quarter battle with the Romans. And the last thing, and this becomes again a positive command. You have to understand that from the context because the neu was the last thing we saw. But it is in fact positive now. And then we can see here, this is the command, right? This is the first command. They should yield, so they should retreat in whatever part, so wherever, right, the Romans made their attack. So wherever the Romans make an attack, the Barbari should retreat, they should back off, and then we get this lovely little aside, right, rendered just in indirect discourse, right? We see the infinitives here, explaining why this even works for the Barbari. They could not now. You might think that the nihil here should be the subject of the indirect speech looking construction, but in fact this is just being used adverbially. So something like in no way. So it was not possible. This posse is being used almost impersonally, okay? An impersonal use of posse. It was not possible for them, this dative with the impersonal construction. It was not possible for them, the Barbari, nocere, to be harmed, passive infinitive, because of, this is like an ablative of cause, because of the lightness of their arms and their daily exercise or practice or training. So the enemy were well suited to this tactic, that the tactic specifically of running away, basically retreating, every time the Romans made an attack. And then, right, so now we come back, the Barbari should yield wherever the Romans make an attack, but then, right, back again, rursus, they should follow, they should pursue, and then this whole phrase right here refers, you have to understand, to the Romans, okay, which doesn't seem immediately obvious because it seems like we should read say, the reflexive, as referring to the Barbari, but not in this case. We have to understand a Romanos or a nostros that is missing. So the command was that they should pursue our men who were recovering themselves. The say is actually the object of this participle recipientes, not the subject. All right, the subject is understood. The enemy should pursue our men who were going back into their ranks, right? Because remember, the Romans are standing in a circle, so one part of that circle charges forth. The enemy, instead of standing and fighting and dying, retreats. Then the Romans have to get back into their circle. That's when the enemy should attack. And sure enough, we see that that is exactly what happened. So, quo praecepto, quo again, hoc, right, correlating relative, hoc praecepto ab eis diligentissime observato. We see here it's an ablative absolute with an ablative of agent and an adverb, a superlative adverb. So we can almost read this as because this order, precept, command, rule, was most carefully observed by the enemy when, or even with this quaipiam is just another way of saying quisque, right? We saw, or quaique because cohortes is feminine. We saw quaique cohortes up above. Anytime each cohort would attack, a great number of the enemy would fall. Same thing here, just Caesar's varying it up with a slightly more archaic word. Whenever each cohort, or again, whenever any cohort, from the circle charged forth and made their attack, the enemy would most quickly flee. They would run back, right? They wouldn't run away, they would just run back. In the meanwhile, so while this all was going on, the Romans attacking, the enemies retreating, that part, right, we understand, of the Romans, of our men, was laid bare. Passive infinitive. Neque erat. Okay, now, this whole thing is a little tricky because technically these phrases, eam partem nudari and, ab latra perto tela recipi, are the subjects of erat, but they are also rendered as infinitive constructions in Latin. They are rendered as oratio obliqua, indirect discourse. That's why eam partem and tela are indicated as subjects. They are the subjects of the infinitives, and then that entire infinitive phrase is the subject of neque erat. All right? It might be easier in English to understand it the other way round, though. All right? And to say something like, in the meanwhile, it necessarily happened that, you see, that's maybe easier for us in English, but grammatically that's not what's happening. These phrases are the subject of erat. So what necessarily had to happen? That part of the troops was laid bare, they were exposed, and then from that open flank, latere aperto, we saw that back in Book 4, when with the landing of the ships, spears were, literally the passive construction, spears or missile weapons were received. So the Romans were attacked by missile weapons. Okay, rursus, again, this idea of, so continuing on or going again. Now, cum, but this time we see cohortes, an indicative verb, so we know right away that this cum only means when, in a temporal clause. When to that spot whence they had departed. Now, this is talking about the Romans, okay? But you'll notice here, let's do a quick scroll down so we can see Caesar is being very, very parallel again. All right, so we should keep an eye on that. So this whole phrase, by the way, doesn't really come into its own until you get down here with relinquebatur. All right, so we have to sort of just wait for a bit. When they, the Romans, let's read this in a more Englishy way rather than trying to go left to right. When the Romans began to come back, this verb is actually deponent, that's why it looks passive, the infinitive, but we're reading it actively because it is a deponent verb, revertur. When the Romans began to go back to that spot from where they had gone out. All right, so a cohort charges and then they have to go back to where they were. What happened to them? Circum vulneratur. They were surrounded. There's a small error here. This circum vulneratur is the main verb. All right, it's not indicated in bold, and it's not tabbed over to the left here like it should be, but it is the main verb. This is the first thing that happened. The Romans got surrounded when they started to go back to the spot that they had charged out from. Okay. Who were they surrounded by? They were surrounded both by the enemy who had retreated and by the enemy who closest stood, right? So who were closest is what we would say in English, but Caesar's using sto stare, right? Steterant in the pluperfect, who stood closest. Okay, so again, if you imagine a circle and one part of it charges out, now that part that just charged out, that cohort, is exposed not only to the enemies that just ran back from them, right, but also to the enemies on either side of them who are now able to attack. Okay, sin, but if, all right, so we see the C in there, so there's a conditional going on here. But if, however, they, the Romans, wanted to hold their ground, so this is if the Roman cohort that charged forth decided they weren't going to retreat. Well, now this phrase right here is passive, and so it can be a little tricky for us to understand. Literally something like, it's something like the place for, this is a dative, right? A place, or really in this case, an opportunity for courage, or again, manly excellence, was not lost, right? It's kind of a roundabout way of saying, if the Romans who charged forth decided to hold their ground, they had an opportunity to show off how courageous they were. All right, but Caesar does it in a passive construction and basically in a litotes, a big old litotes. They did not, we would say they did not lose the opportunity for courage. But with the passive construction, the opportunity for courage was not lost. This dative is going kind of with locus, not so much with relinquebatur. Nor, however, okay, could they, the Romans, being conferti, this participle is describing the Romans, understood subject of poterant, okay, nor could the Romans, being so tightly packed, avoid the spears, the missile weapons, that were thrown by such a great crowd. All right, so it's kind of like the Romans are caught in a catch-22. If the Romans charge forth and decide they don't want to retreat back to the circle, but instead they want to hold this ground they just took, well, sure, they don't miss an opportunity to display their manly excellence, their courage, but they also, being packed so tightly, can't avoid all the missile weapons, the spears and javelins and whatnot, being thrown at them by such a great crowd of the enemy. So, however, now we move on with the fight. And again, still our men, still our Romans, understood as the subject here of resistebant. Our men were conflictati. Okay, they were not conflicted. That's not the right word that we want to use. They were afflicted. Okay, they were overwhelmed by, or with, perhaps you could say, so many disadvantages. Remember incommode from a couple chapters back when they were implementing their plan to abandon their baggage and stand in a circle, and everything came out incommode, disastrously. So our men have been beset by so many disadvantages, by so many disasters. And then we have this ablative absolute, with many wounds having been received. Nevertheless, remember that tamen, they fought back. Resistebant. And magna parte die consumta, another simple ablative absolute, with a great part of the day having been spent, so the day is almost over, because, right, why is a great part of the day used up? Because from first light until the 8th hour, there was fighting. This is, again, this impersonal passive construction. It was fought. The battle was fought. From first light, so that would be roughly 6 in the morning, until the 8th hour of the day. So that would be roughly 2 p.m. Nihil comitebant. This nihil is the object of comitebant. This is our men. Our men committed nothing. They did nothing, quod. Antecedent of quod is nihil. This is a relative, not a causal. Our men did nothing which was unworthy of them. Ipsis is technically dative because indignum wants a dative. The adjective dignus in Latin frequently occurs with a dative. So does its negative indignus. Our men did nothing that was unworthy of them. And then here we're going to get, this is one of the joys of reading Caesar. Every now and then, quite frequently actually, Caesar stops to highlight the bravery of individual soldiers. And even though this is a horrible moment, these men are dying, he still stops to highlight the bravery of his troops. Okay, so let's find out about Titus Balventius, and let's just go as we read left to right. Let's find out who this man is. Well, the first thing we learn is that he was a man who, in the previous year, so just 1 year ago, had held the first, or had led the first spear. So if we remember our Roman legions, right, the centurions have their own ranking system, and the first spear centurion was essentially the highest ranking centurion in a legion. So Balventius last year had been the primus pilus centurion, the first spear centurion. What else do we learn about the man? Well, we learn that this is in apposition to Tito Balventio. We learn that he was a viro forti, he was a brave man. And then we also learn, now this is not dative, we see, magna autoritatis. This is not dative, this is genitive. This is a genitive of quality with viro. So Caesar's just changing it up a little bit here. Instead of giving us 2 adjectives, he gives us 1 adjective, viro forti, forti, and then he gives us another adjectival expression in the form of a genitive of quality. So he was not only a brave man, but he was a man of great authority or of great seriousness. What happened to him? Both femurs, again, uterque, we read it as plural even though it's singular, both legs by a javelin were pierced. All right, and then Tito Balventio in the dative is actually a dative of interest. So for Titus Balventius, both legs were pierced by a javelin. Therefore, he died. Quintus Lucanius, notice Caesar does not deploy any, there's no connectors here. Right, we have another instance of asyndeton. It's as if we're just seeing these things one after the other, right? No matter where we look, right, some act of bravery is worthy of commemoration. Let's go on to Quintus Lucanius. Well, who is he? He is eiustem ordinis, another genitive of quality of the same rank. So we are relating this to Balventius up above. Lucanius was also a first spear centurion, a primus pilus. Fortissime pugnans, nice present active participle, fighting most bravely, dum circumvento filios subvenet, while he was bringing aid to his son, who was surrounded. So circumvento and filio go together. They're both dative. Subvenet, interesting fun fact, when we take a verb of motion like venire and we prefix it with sub, it changes the meaning of the verb to frequently mean something like to come or go or run or what have you, to bring aid, to help. So he was coming to his son, who was surrounded, to help him. Interficitur, he was killed. All right, we don't get the same graphic detail as what happened to poor Titus, but Quintus Lucanius was also killed, and then we see Lucius Cotta. Oh no, don't worry, he's not dead yet. Lucius Cotta, the legatus, what was he doing? He was encouraging all the cohorts and all the ranks. Vulneratur in adversum os. Now this is kind of can be a tricky phrase to understand. He was wounded in the mouth, in os, right? The use of this adjective adversum gives it a sense something like full on in the mouth, or in the mouth that was directly opposite. So the idea is he did not receive with a funda, with a slingshot. So he did not receive a glancing blow to the side of the face, and he took a sling rock, right, a slingshot, directly in his face, and was wounded. That's the idea of in adversum os, straight on in the face. So now Cotta has been wounded. We've seen two experienced, high-ranking centurions die. Things are not going well for our Romans, and we will see how this plays out in the next couple of chapters. It's not going to last much longer, unfortunately. Maximus gratias for sticking it out, and we will see you in the next one. Valete.